Hello, and welcome to my office. And this is uh SLSS 1020 Introduction to Higher Education's course, and we're talking about classical theories of motivation in education. This is a Kings Peak and Salt Lake Community College co-production. Okay, we start off with the question: what is the purpose of education? And this question's been asked many different ways and many different times. All right, let's get rid of that thing there. So from the earliest days of Western education, we had the establishment of academies in the Greek or Hellenistic city-states. Plato being the origin of the academy, it's where the term comes from. And this is what Plato said the reason why he founded this in the spirit of Socrates was for. Let our artists rather be those who are gifted to discern the true nature of the beautiful and the graceful. Then will our youth receive good in everything, and beauty, the effluviance of fair works, shall flow into the eye and ear like a health-giving breeze from a pure region, and insensibly draw from the soul the earliest years into the likeness of sympathy, the beauty of reason. So what education was for Plato was to understand the good, the beautiful, and the graceful, and how they existed eternally in the name of the forms. And you had to have the leisure time to pursue that in a serious way, thus the nature of the academy. These were not state-funded institutions. I mean, we're talking so early, it's hard for you to put your mind around, but I want you to think about it. The largest governments in Greece at this time were cities. They didn't necessarily support all of this in the way that you're thinking. Let's go on. So when people set up academies, they needed to be self-sufficient, and they kind of had to be rich. But this is where the idea attributed to Socrates of know thyself comes from. That's what that term means in Greek, by the way. The reason why you need to be educated to know the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the forms thereof in the eternal sense that Plato envisioned them, was also so you could know who and what you were. That was the purpose of education for the Platonic philosophers. And they're some of the first people who built formal schools. Roman education was very different, although it came out of a similar habitus. That's a big word for habit and surrounding region. Roman education was actually supported by both the Roman Republic, which is kind of like a state and wasn't just a city-state, but an actual state that conquered most of Italy, then the Hellenistic kingdoms, and large parts of Asia Minor, which we now call the Middle East, and North Africa, including places like Libya, Egypt, Morocco, etc. And they also took over Spain, and then eventually went all the way to the German borderlands and took over Britain and got all the way taking over the entire top end of Africa. Yeah, it was a big empire. There were bigger ones, but it was the biggest one that anything out of, quote, Europe understood at the time, although Europe as a concept didn't exist yet, so it's kind of anachronistic to say that. But Roman education was more practical. It was aimed at preparing people to be able to enter the life of the Republic or service of the empire. So reading, writing, law, the ability to argue, rhetoric. These were things that were crucial to the Roman worldview of education, and it was a very practical form of education. And it was subsidized by the state, and the teachers were mostly Greek slaves. In fact, the word pedagogy, which is the word we use for how to teach, comes from the word pedagogue, which meant walking slave, because they would use slaves that were captured in war who were highly educated in the Greek system to come in and teach children. often patronized by the father of the household, called the paterfamilias, and later on by the empire itself. So kind of dark history there, but it is the history. I guess trigger warning. All right, let's go on. University in Cairo. Well, universities developed in the Islamic world, particularly in North Africa after the fall of the Roman Empire. They were primarily for the preservation of Sharia and for learning classical Arabic and the hadiths and the Quran, but they also did science, and they're actually some of like Arabic numbers, Arabic numerals are way of doing numbers. That our modern way of doing numbers comes from modified Arabic numerals from India. Interesting for you to know, right? And they also kept up with the pre-Christian, pre-Islamic classics. So Aristotle and Plato were taught in universities in Cairo. And in fact, when it was picked back up in Europe during the Renaissance and the 13th and 14th century, they got the manuscripts from the Islamic world, and they got them after the Crusades. All right. So, but the reason why education was so important in the Muslim world was so that you could know God and enforce the laws of God more. All right. It's actually very similar to the Jewish world, which also taught values literacy and would teach people to read extensively so that you would know the laws of God and could teach them. That's what rabbi means. Rabbi means teacher. And we know that the Islamic and Jewish worlds were overlapping, and also some with the Christian world. If you've never heard about this, you should study medieval history more. All right, then what about China? Well, China also had conceptions of this. I'm sorry that you can't see this well. Let me see if I can change our perspective real fast, so maybe you can see it a little better. All right, we'll go back to the other view and it's bigger in a second. When the stables were burnt down or returning from court, Confucius said, "Who was anyone hurt?" He did not ask about the horses. All right, now that's kind of a human-centered point of view, but the purpose of education in the classics and the idea of standardized tests were invented by Confucius or the Confucian scholars, and probably not Confucius himself, although it is accredited to him. In the various Chinese, there are multiple Chinese empires: the Qing, the Ming, the Song, etc. I'm not going to go into Chinese history, and you probably haven't learned that much about it, but this is a very old idea. Confucius is roughly before, I mean, he's significantly before Aristotle and Plato and that gaggle of people, and those people are before, I mean, that's 500 BC. So we're talking, between 1000 and 500 BC for Confucius. And he thought that education was about valorizing the human world and producing bureaucrats who could maintain balance and familial piety. And familial piety is the idea that the family is sacred. All right. And the education was to better serve the family, and the young would serve the old, so they would be served by their young, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have another reason to be motivated here is to get an education to enter the government. That's what the standardized tests were for, to work for the imperial bureaucracy, but also to be able to better serve your family. Okay, that's another vision of education. This is Christian monasticism, and like the Islamic world, Christian universities and Christian grammar schools, which taught people Latin so they could read and train clergy and lawyers. That's primarily what it was for. So people who serve the king are people who serve the church, and to know the laws of God better. That's what it was for. Monks were trained to write. Some of them couldn't read what they were writing, though, and they were to keep the main information in. Medieval universities actually expanded from the 11th century to the 14th century and then fell out of favor during the Renaissance. But it's something to note that it was about knowing and administering the laws of God. So like in the Islamic case, this has both a secular and a religious function. All right. So they taught rhetoric, math, logic, and scripture. And they taught composition, but composition not in the native language of the country, but in Latin. All right, and this is modern education. That's you guys. And we have a lot of these ideas in modern education. Education is to better yourself. Education is to get a job. Education is to better understand your world. We have a lot of different justifications. Who provides education? Well, all kinds of groups. Your parents, the state, by the state I mean the government, your religious institutions, all provide different forms of education for you, and they're paid for in different ways. All right, but the motivation for getting it is both self-embetterment in a kind of nebulous sense, and to be able to get a job. So it's both practical and spiritual in the same way. The modern secular university developed out of the medieval universities. They actually started off as religious universities in the main in Europe. This is Bologna. The other thing that they did and began is they started indenture, which is basically an apprenticeship where you worked for, not for pay, your pay was the skills, but your master had to take care of you. So like they had to give you food and housing and all that, clothing and materials. So in exchange for your materials and the ability, you would be indentured to someone who would teach you your craft. It was often someone in your family. And that was a system that stayed in place largely until the Industrial Revolution really took off in the 17th and 18th century. We also had secular universities, but they began often as religious universities to train pastors and lawyers, again, in the United States, the first being Harvard. And they started predominantly in New England. That's where a lot of the Ivy League is, right? But they had a broader mission than the medieval universities. They were training people to go into business as well, and their mission expanded pretty quickly. Here's the university in Utah, the University of Deseret. I've actually been there. It's a one building little room, but it was to train Mormon religious leaders, and you can see it wasn't very big. And this is BYU or the U. I can't remember. I think this is BYU. Let me change the view here so we can kind of see it better. Yeah, land grant schools. No, this is the U. So we had the establishment of land grant schools, which were paid for again by the state, by giving these public schools large chunks of land to develop and compete with the private schools that had already developed. These really sprung up after the Civil War in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they're the basis for the modern public school university system. All right. They also had a change in education, and this was from John Dewey's kind of early American view. This is from the early 20th century. John Dewey was really important as an educational theorist in the 1930s. Only free and continued education can counteract the forces which are always at work to restore, however, in a changed form, feudal oligarchy. Democracy is born anew every generation, in education as its midwife. So John Dewey thinks that the motivation for education is so that we can be good democratic participants, to know enough on how to choose leaders and to maintain our own government. So that was the theory here, and it's almost completely secular. All right. Then we had the establishment of junior colleges and community colleges, which was mostly for training people for work. These are some of the different theories of education that come up. All right. So let me get back to that so you can see it a little better. Moral ethical education. We talked about that in some of the ancient forms, in particular, Plato and Confucius, and the Islamic and Christian and Jewish university system. Professional and economic education that was based on teaching people enough to be productive workers. and political and social education, which is about you being able to participate in democratic or, in earlier times, imperial or kingship, for you to be able to fully instantiate everything that you're able to develop in this for the betterment of the state or for the betterment of your participation in that society. These are all modes of education that show up, and it's something to think about as you proceed to think about what mode you should go into. I hope that you take it seriously. Think about these theories of motivation. Which ones appeal to you, and how do you think they've changed throughout time? This is a 15-minute introduction to the entire history of education. I had the short shrift a lot. I didn't go into like indigenous Americans' view of education. They did have them, although it was more oral traditions. Although there were probably things like universities in Mesoamerica where you had large urban centers. I didn't go into the education in India and like the major Buddhist universities. There's a bunch of them as well. There's a lot I didn't go into. This is just a taste. Believe it or not, I have a very intense interest in the anthropology of education and its history. So if you ever want to know more about it, I'd be happy to talk to you about it in a Zoom. But right now, this is your introduction to the theories of motivation and why we've cared about education in the past. All right. Thank you.